What happens when the people you love most forget you're human? For years, Ava carried everyone. She worked, she sacrificed. She opened her door every time someone knocked, because that's what good mothers do, right? But one ordinary afternoon, when she walked into her own home and found it already claimed without permission, something inside her finally broke. Or maybe it awakened. This isn't just a story about family. It's about invisible emotional labor. It's about the silent exhaustion we bury under smiles. It's about the moment a woman who spent decades being available finally decides to protect the one thing she never defended before, herself. And when she finally says no, everything changes. Love, respect, relationships, even identity. So the question isn't, why did she refuse? The real question is, how long had she been expected not to? Ava never imagined a quiet afternoon could shatter years of silence so suddenly. She came home carrying grocery bags, expecting nothing more than peace, routine, and the comfort of familiarity. Instead, she walked into a reality that didn't belong to her. A room already claimed, suitcases planted like flags, conversations already decided without her presence. It wasn't simply about someone being in her home. It was the realization that somewhere along the way, she had stopped being a person and had slowly become a convenience. The look she gave wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a stillness that comes when something inside finally refuses to bend anymore. What do you do when your home, the only place left where your soul breathes, is treated like a spare room in someone else's life? The shock wasn't just in what she saw. It was in what it revealed, because that moment didn't come out of nowhere. It arrived carrying years of quiet compromises, polite smiles, and swallowed emotions. It carried nights when Ava stayed awake thinking, "They don't really see me, do they?" It carried the tired ache of a heart that had spent decades saying yes while secretly suffocating. There is always a moment, a final straw, that exposes every ignored feeling we've hidden to keep peace. This was hers. She wasn't angry the way movies portray anger. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't trembling. What she felt was something deeper, heavier, a realization that she had been living a life where her comfort was optional, but her availability was permanent. And as much as love lived in that house, so did expectation, so did entitlement, so did the assumption that Ava would always bend. But there comes a time when even the most patient hearts reach their threshold, not out of bitterness, but out of survival. As voices tried to explain, justify, normalize, Ava didn't just hear words. She heard patterns. She heard history. She heard every moment she'd been overlooked condensed into one unapologetic intrusion. And in that pause, that quiet breath where the world felt painfully still, a question echoed louder than anything anyone was saying. If I don't protect my peace now, will I ever be allowed to have it? That's when fear turned into clarity. Not dramatic clarity. Not cinematic heroism. Just a firm, grounded understanding that loving people doesn't mean sacrificing yourself until nothing remains. And yet, saying that aloud, standing in it, wasn't easy. Because boundaries don't just challenge others. They challenge the roles you've always played. So, on that ordinary afternoon, a woman who had spent years being the strong one, the accommodating one, the dependable one, finally saw herself clearly. She wasn't the villain. She wasn't selfish. She wasn't cold. She was simply human. A woman who had earned the right to rest. A woman who had earned the right to choose peace. A woman who had spent decades giving, and finally realized it was not a betrayal to protect herself, That was the day everything changed. Not because she discovered conflict, but because she discovered courage. And while no one in that room yet fully understood it, Ava had taken the first step toward a truth many people never reach. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is disappoint others, to finally stop disappointing yourself. Before this moment, Ava's life had been defined by one simple pattern. People needed, and she provided. From the time she was young, she had been taught that love meant endurance, patience, and a quiet kind of strength that rarely received applause. When life demanded more, she simply stretched herself thinner. When others stumbled, she became the steady ground beneath them. And for years it felt noble, even beautiful, to be the dependable one. But over time, something subtle began to fade. Happiness didn't disappear with a dramatic crash. It drained slowly, like light slipping out of a room without anyone noticing. Every favor, every sacrifice, every moment she told herself, "It's okay, I'll manage," added another invisible weight to a life already carrying too much. And yet, Ava rarely complained. When you spend decades serving others, you don't notice how heavy it's become, until your knees finally buckle. Being strong became her identity, and in a world that praises resilience, no one ever stopped to ask whether she was tired. Friends admired her, family relied on her. Society applauded women like Ava, selfless, reliable, endlessly giving. But admiration doesn't refill empty emotional reserves. She remembered the countless times she skipped her own plans to help someone else, the quiet evenings she gave up, the rest she postponed, the dreams she folded neatly and tucked away because someone needed her more. She had been the emergency exit in everyone's crisis, the spare room, the backup plan. And the painful truth was, she had contributed to this narrative. Every time she said yes when she wanted to say no, she unintentionally taught the world that her needs were negotiable while everyone else's were urgent. That "she'll understand" became a guarantee, not a hope. Years had passed like this. Holidays where she catered to everyone else's comfort. Celebrations where she hosted but rarely felt celebrated. Conversations where she listened but was rarely heard. She remembered moments when a thank you never came, but she brushed it aside because gratitude wasn't why she helped. Or so she told herself. But love without acknowledgement becomes work. Work without rest becomes exhaustion. And exhaustion turns into grief for a life unlived. Ava wasn't angry at the people she loved. She was heartbroken by how invisible she had slowly become in their eyes, and worse, in her own. Because somewhere along the journey she had accepted the lie that her presence was valuable only when it was useful, that her worth was tied to what she could provide, not who she was. And once you start believing that, it becomes almost impossible to remember you deserve more. Looking back, she didn't blame any single moment for breaking her. It wasn't one dramatic incident. It was the accumulation of little ones, taken for granted gestures, assumptions that she would always be available, expectations wrapped in affection. She had loved deeply, and she still did. But love, she was finally realizing, should never require you to disappear. Saying yes for years had made everyone comfortable, except her. And now, standing on the edge of change, Ava understood something she never allowed herself to acknowledge before. Boundaries are not walls that shut love out. They are doors that teach love how to enter respectfully. This chapter of her life wasn't about rebellion. It was about self-rescue. And for the first time in decades, Ava was beginning to imagine a life where her needs were not negotiable, but necessary. There's a moment in many relationships when love subtly changes shape. and most people don't even notice it happening. What begins as warmth, generosity, and connection slowly turns into expectation. Kindness becomes routine, help becomes assumed, and suddenly, what once felt like a gift now feels like a duty stamped onto your identity. Ava had lived through that shift without ever naming it. She loved deeply. That part was never in question. But somewhere along the way, her love stopped being something she offered and started becoming something she owed. People didn't ask if she could help. They simply expected she would. They didn't wonder whether she was tired. They assumed she'd manage. And Ava, like so many who care too much, tried to convince herself this was normal, that this was family, that this was love. But love, she was beginning to realize, should never erase the person giving it. What made it hurt wasn't the requests themselves. It was the silence around her humanity. When people came to her, they didn't ask how she was doing. They didn't pause to consider whether she might have limits. Instead, she became the reliable answer to every problem. And the more she gave, the less anyone noticed it was costing her something. She could recall moments when she forced a smile despite the ache in her chest, when she agreed to help even as exhaustion screamed inside her. She listened to arguments that weren't hers, held burdens she didn't create, and became the emotional anchor everyone tied themselves to, without ever asking if she wanted to carry that weight. Love had become a currency she was expected to keep supplying, free, constant, unquestioned. And though no one said it aloud, the message was clear. If Ava stops giving, then something must be wrong with Ava. But the truth is, obligation drains the soul of tenderness. It turns affection into pressure, warmth into duty, closeness into quiet resentment. And that resentment doesn't explode dramatically. It settles. It lingers. It makes every smile feel heavier than the last. Ava wasn't resentful because she didn't love them. She was resentful because her love was being taken for granted. When care is never reciprocated, it stops feeling like love and starts feeling like servitude. She remembered moments where she needed comfort but remained silent because others had it worse. Times she wished someone would simply notice she wasn't okay. Yet years passed, and no one saw what was happening behind her steady exterior. Because people who always appear strong rarely get asked if they're hurting, and people who give endlessly, slowly, disappear in the background of other people's lives, appreciated in words but rarely considered in actions. So when that day finally came, the day she was expected once again to accommodate, to adjust, to disappear quietly for the sake of someone else's comfort, something inside Ava no longer aligned with the script she'd always followed. Love shouldn't feel like obligation. It shouldn't demand silence. It shouldn't require someone to erase themselves just to keep peace. True love invites respect. It makes room for boundaries. It acknowledges effort. And Ava, after years of believing she wasn't allowed to choose herself, finally began to understand that her worth didn't come from how much she endured, but from simply existing as a person deserving of care too. This realization didn't make the situation easier. In fact, it complicated everything. But it also lit a quiet fire inside her. A voice she had spent decades suppressing was finally whispering something different. Love shouldn't hurt your existence to prove it's real. Invisibility doesn't happen suddenly. It happens quietly, patiently, over years of being fine when you aren't, of stepping aside so others can take center stage, of shrinking your needs so they don't inconvenience anyone. Ava hadn't vanished from her own life overnight. She faded, gradually, softly, so softly that even she didn't notice at first. She had learned how to slip into the background, how to make herself smaller in conversations, how to smile when her heart wanted to scream. She became the person who blended into family gatherings, there, present, essential, but somehow emotionally unseen. People laughed, talked, planned futures, debated opinions, and somewhere on the edges of every room, Ava quietly existed, offering warmth and presence without ever being truly acknowledged. The world around her didn't stop to ask when she disappeared. It simply adjusted to the silence she had learned to carry. It wasn't that no one loved her. They did, but they loved the version of her that asked for nothing. The dependable woman, the caretaker, the emotional cushion. And because she rarely voiced her needs, everyone assumed she didn't have any. That she was endlessly strong. That nothing hurt her deeply enough to deserve concern. So when conversations circled back to other people's chaos, other people's dreams, other people's struggles, Ava listened. She nodded. She supported. And afterward, she'd go home, sit in her silent living room, and realize no one had asked how she was doing. Not really. When was the last time someone leaned in with genuine interest and said, "How is your heart?" She couldn't remember. That's the cruel thing about invisibility. It teaches you to disappear willingly, just to keep the peace. And yet, invisibility isn't emptiness. It's a heavy coat made of swallowed words and unspoken emotions. Ava carried every, "It's okay," every, "Don't worry about me," every moment she accepted being secondary. She remembered times she wanted to say, "I'm tired," but instead laughed it off. Times she wanted to say, "I feel alone," but changed the subject. Times she wanted to say, "Please see me," but convinced herself it was too much to ask. When you spend years dismissing your own feelings, you stop believing they matter. That's how people like Ava become invisible. Not because no one can see them, but because they stop believing they deserve to be seen. Society romanticizes sacrifice, especially in women like her, calling it strength, devotion, and love. But constant self-erasure isn't noble. It's painful. It's lonely. And sooner or later the soul demands to exist again. So standing in that moment, the moment when her home was treated as if her permission didn't matter, Ava wasn't just reacting to a single event. She was reacting to years of invisibility finally becoming unbearable. That day didn't simply force her to confront others. It forced her to confront herself, to ask, when did I stop believing my boundaries mattered? When did I decide my feelings were optional? And more importantly, when did I become okay with disappearing? For the first time in a long time, Ava didn't step aside. She didn't swallow discomfort. She didn't choose silence for the sake of keeping the peace. She chose herself. And choosing herself didn't make her cruel or selfish. It made her visible again. It reminded her she still existed, not as a supporting character in everyone else's lives, but as a person whose peace mattered. That realization didn't erase the years she spent unseen, but it marked the beginning of something powerful. The return of a woman who finally refused to disappear. Confrontations aren't always loud. Sometimes they're heartbreakingly calm. When Ava finally stood there, facing the two people who assumed her life could bend to fit theirs, her voice didn't rise. It steadied. There were no dramatic gestures, no storm of insults, no chaos. Just truth. Raw, undeniable truth. She wasn't questioning whether they needed help. She was questioning why nobody thought she deserved to be asked. That's what hurt the most. Not the inconvenience, not the disruption, but the entitlement. The automatic belief that she would simply adjust her world to make theirs easier. As they explained and defended and tried to rationalize, Ava listened with a strange clarity. Every word they spoke echoed years of unspoken expectation. Because you're Mom. Because you always help. Because you'll understand. And for the first time, she refused to accept that understanding meant erasing herself. What followed wasn't simply an argument. It was an unmasking. Every delayed apology, every minimized feeling, every assumption that she would simply manage, rose to the surface. She could see it in their expressions. They weren't prepared for resistance. They weren't prepared for a mother who finally stepped out of the role of permanent savior. When she said no, they didn't hear boundaries. They heard betrayal. And like many who benefit from someone else's silence, they reacted with shock, frustration, and disbelief. But Ava didn't flinch. Beneath her calm exterior was a lifetime of pain, exhaustion, and emotional neglect, gathering strength. She wasn't trying to win. She wasn't trying to punish them. She was simply trying to exist without disappearing. For once, she wasn't negotiating her peace. She wasn't softening her truth to make it more comfortable to swallow. She spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who finally believed her feelings mattered. Of course, the words didn't land gently. They rarely do when someone has grown used to your compliance. They questioned her, guilted her, tried to remind her of everything she had done in the past, as if her history of sacrifice obligated her to continue forever. They framed her resistance as selfishness. They painted her boundary as cruelty. But Ava knew something they didn't. Boundaries don't hurt relationships. They reveal them. And what was being revealed wasn't evil or malicious. It was emotional immaturity, dependency, and years of normalized expectations finally cracking open under truth. Standing there, Ava realized something deeply painful, yet liberating. Sometimes people get angry not because you wronged them, but because you finally stopped letting them wrong you. The air in the room became heavy with unsaid emotions, with fear, with pride, with the shock of witnessing someone who had always yielded suddenly stand firm. It wasn't just a confrontation between people. It was a confrontation between old roles and new reality. And yet, beneath the tension, there was grief. Ava wasn't triumphant. She was trembling inside. Choosing herself didn't feel victorious. It felt terrifying. But courage isn't loud. Courage is a trembling voice that still speaks. It's a heart that beats faster but refuses to retreat. And as the moment ended, as anger rose, tears formed, and silence closed in, Ava knew life wouldn't be the same after this. She had changed the script. She had rewritten her part in the story. She had finally said, "I matter too." And while it cost her comfort, understanding, and possibly connection, it also gave her something she hadn't had in years. A sense of dignity she didn't have to bury anymore. That confrontation wasn't the destruction of love. It was the painful, necessary breaking of chains, disguised as affection. And even though no one in that room fully understood it yet, this was the moment Ava truly reclaimed herself. Saying no sounds simple, until you realize how many relationships were built on your willingness to always say yes. The moment Ava chose herself, an invisible shift rippled through everything. The room didn't just fall quiet, it fractured. Familiar warmth was replaced with cold disbelief. Faces that once looked at her with comfort now stared as if she had become a stranger. And this is the hidden cost of boundaries. They don't just protect you. They expose the truth of how others valued you. Love that depended on sacrifice began to feel conditional. Support that existed only when she complied suddenly evaporated. Guilt appeared like a shadow whispering, "Look what you've done." But another voice, quieter, steadier, reminded her, "Look what you've endured." Ava felt both voices in her chest, waging war. She was shaking inside, not because she regretted her choice, but because she finally understood how fragile respect becomes when it was never truly there in the first place. The emotional backlash came fast. Accusations disguised as concern, shock disguised as disappointment, and the most painful one, silence. Silence has a way of screaming louder than any argument. Instead of understanding, there were raised brows. Instead of empathy, there was judgment. Instead of someone saying, "We're sorry. We should have asked." What she received was blame. They talked about inconvenience. They talked about timing. They talked about how a few days wasn't a big deal. But nobody talked about how deeply it hurt to feel unimportant in your own home. Nobody acknowledged the exhaustion of being taken for granted. Nobody asked what it cost her to carry everyone else's world. And that's when she fully realized people hear no differently, depending on how much they benefited from your silence. Saying no didn't just inconvenience them. It forced them to confront the comfort they had built out of her compliance. But the cost wasn't only external. It lived inside her too. That night, when the noise faded and the door finally closed, the weight of her choice spread through her like a storm. She sat alone, not triumphant, not hardened, but profoundly human. Tears came. Not because she doubted herself, but because strength is heavy. For years, she had been the one to soothe, to reassure, to hold everyone together. Now she had to hold herself. Regret didn't visit her, but grief did. Grief for the girl who learned early that love meant endless endurance. Grief for the woman who waited decades to claim peace. Grief for the relationships that might never look the same again. People rarely talk about this part, how self-respect can ache. How standing up for yourself sometimes feels like breaking your own heart, so you can finally heal it properly. Yet beneath that grief was something else too. Something fragile but powerful. There was relief. Quiet, gentle, undeniable relief. For the first time in years, the air around her belonged only to her. The walls of her home didn't feel invaded. Her spirit didn't feel cornered. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a background character in her own life. Yes, the cost was real. Yes, it hurt. Yes, relationships now trembled on unfamiliar ground. But sometimes the price of peace is confronting the storms you spent your life avoiding. Ava realized something profound. Saying no doesn't destroy love. It reveals whether love can survive without control. And while the world around her adjusted to this new reality, Ava sat quietly with herself and discovered that even though strength feels lonely at first, it also feels like finally breathing. Silence can feel terrifying when you're used to living in constant emotional noise. But for Ava, the quiet after everything unfolded wasn't empty. It was revealing. When the house finally settled and the echo of arguments faded, she sat alone in the stillness and truly heard herself for the first time in years. No demands, no expectations, no responsibilities pulling at her, just her heartbeat. Steady, uncertain, yet undeniably alive. She replayed every moment, every word, every expression. Not to torture herself, but to understand. And in that reflection, she realized something deeply human. She had spent so much of her life reacting to others that she had almost forgotten what it meant to simply be. Now, in this silence, she wasn't disappearing. She was rediscovering herself. Of course, silence isn't always gentle. It also brings clarity, and clarity can sting. Ava began to see how long she had ignored her own voice. She remembered the countless moments she brushed off discomfort, telling herself it wasn't worth trouble. She remembered times she laughed instead of crying, agreeing instead of expressing hurt. And now, every one of those swallowed emotions resurfaced, not as regret, but as proof of how much she'd endured. She realized she had trained everyone to believe she didn't need boundaries by never showing them she had any. That hurt, because it meant she also played a role in her own invisibility. But instead of drowning in guilt, Ava chose truth. The truth that she had done her best with the tools she had. The truth that love conditioned her to endure. And the truth that growth often begins with uncomfortable honesty, especially with yourself. Slowly, reflection turned into healing. She allowed herself to cry without shame, to grieve without explaining, to feel without shrinking. Those tears weren't weakness. They were release. Every tear carried years of exhaustion. Every sigh carried the weight of expectations she was finally laying down. She felt vulnerable. Yes, but vulnerability didn't feel like defeat anymore. It felt like humanity. She remembered advice, memories, whispered wisdom from her past. Reminders that life doesn't pause for your breaking point, but it does honor your courage to rebuild differently. And as she sat with her truth, Ava didn't feel angry anymore. She felt aware of patterns, aware of wounds, aware of strength she didn't know she had because it had always been spent on others instead of herself. And then something beautiful happened. Peace didn't rush in dramatically. It arrived gently. Not as loud happiness, but as quiet steadiness. She could breathe without guilt. She could think without fear. She could exist without apology. Reflection didn't magically fix relationships, didn't instantly heal misunderstandings, didn't erase pain. But it did give her something invaluable. Understanding. And with understanding came grounding. Ava wasn't just redefining relationships. She was redefining herself. She realized that this silence wasn't loneliness. It was space. Space to become. Space to feel worthy. Space to believe she deserved a life where love wasn't earned through sacrifice, but honored through respect. This silence, once frightening, had become her shelter. The place where truth finally had room to speak. Love had always meant giving for Ava. It meant bending, accommodating, softening herself so everyone else could feel comfortable. But now, sitting with everything she had experienced, she began to understand something she had never allowed herself to believe. Love without respect is not love. It's dependency wearing kindness as a mask. True love doesn't punish you for having needs. True love doesn't retreat when you draw a boundary. And true love certainly doesn't require you to disappear so others can remain comfortable. As Ava reflected, she realized she had loved fiercely, but she had rarely been loved responsibly. And there is a difference. One warms you, the other slowly drains you. That realization wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. It was simply honest. And honesty has a quiet way of shifting the entire foundation of your life. She began to question everything she'd been taught. Why do we praise people who give endlessly, but rarely ask who is caring for them? Why is sacrifice glorified more than emotional balance? Why do we call it love when someone relies on you completely, yet hesitate to call it love when someone respects your limits? Ava started to see how society romanticizes suffering, especially in women, labeling self-neglect as devotion, calling exhaustion strength, and disguising emotional neglect as family responsibility. But real love doesn't demand that you bleed quietly. Real love allows room for everyone to exist fully, not just the ones who shout the loudest. And if love makes you feel small, unheard, or unimportant, then something is very wrong with the way it's being practiced. So Ava began rewriting her personal definition of love. Not with grand speeches, but with quiet conviction. Love, she realized, is not measured by how much you can endure. It is measured by how safely you can exist within it. Love is not proven through constant sacrifice. It is proven through mutual care. Love should never feel like walking on emotional eggshells, nor should it feel like carrying the entire emotional world of others, while yours remains unattended. Real love sees you. It notices your exhaustion. It respects your no. It doesn't panic when you protect yourself. Instead, it adjusts, adapts, grows. This understanding didn't erase the pain of what she had lived, but it reframed it. She wasn't cruel for saying no. She wasn't selfish for choosing peace. She was simply choosing a healthier kind of love, one she'd never realized she deserved. And maybe that was the most powerful shift of all. Ava stopped seeing herself as the villain in her story. She stopped feeling guilty for wanting dignity in her relationships. She stopped apologizing for existing as a person with limits. Instead, she allowed herself to believe something deeply radical. I deserve the kind of love I have always given. Not partial love, not conditional love, not love that only exists when she is needed, but love grounded in awareness, accountability, and mutual respect. Rewriting love didn't mean rejecting those she cared about. It meant inviting them into a healthier, more honest space. A space where everyone, including Ava, was allowed to matter. And though the process was painful, it was also transformative. Because once you finally understand what real love should feel like, you can never go back to calling pain affection again. Choosing yourself is powerful, but it is rarely simple. As days passed, the emotional aftermath unfolded like slow-moving waves, each carrying new reactions, new conversations, new consequences. Some people judged Ava. Some pitied her. Some pretended nothing happened at all. The whispers came, the opinions came, the subtle shifts in tone came. People who once saw her as endlessly accommodating now saw her as changed. But here's the truth no one warns you about. When you stop living for approval, you start seeing who was only comfortable with you, as long as you stayed small. Ava felt the sting of distance, of misunderstood intentions, of relationships wobbling under the weight of truth. Yet beneath that fear, there was a steadiness growing inside her, a grounded awareness that she had finally acted from self-respect rather than guilt. And courage, she realized, is not about avoiding loss. It's about trusting that what remains will be real. Still, courage doesn't erase emotion. There were moments when her heart tightened thinking of the people she loved. Moments when doubt crept in late at night, whispering, "Was it worth it?" Moments when memories tugged at her gently, reminding her of laughter, warmth, history. Yet each time doubt surfaced, truth did too. She remembered how it felt to be unseen. She remembered the exhaustion she carried. She remembered the silence she had swallowed for years. Those memories weren't bitterness. They were clarity, and clarity gave her strength to stand firm, even when it hurt. Because healing isn't choosing between love and boundaries. It's learning that true love makes room for boundaries. The consequences were real, yes, but so was her growth. And for the first time, Ava wasn't shrinking to protect relationships. She was allowing relationships to grow up or fall away. Interestingly, not every reaction was negative. Some people surprised her. A few reached out not with guilt, but with understanding. Some apologized. Some reflected. Some admitted they had never realized how much she carried in silence. That mattered. It didn't erase everything, but it showed something essential. Sometimes courage doesn't destroy connections. It reshapes them. It teaches others how to meet you with respect. It invites maturity, empathy, and accountability. Ava didn't need grand apologies. What she needed was recognition. And slowly, in small but meaningful ways, some began to see her not as an endless resource, but as a person with feelings, limits, and worth. The world didn't instantly transform, but it shifted, just enough for her to see the possibility of healthier bonds ahead. And perhaps the greatest courage of all wasn't what she showed to others, but the courage she showed to herself. Courage to sit with discomfort, courage to stay steady in vulnerability, courage to believe she deserved peace even if others misunderstood it. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. Relationships were still tender. Some were distant, some were uncertain. But Ava was no longer afraid of that uncertainty, because for the first time in years, she wasn't living in fear of losing people. She was living in commitment to not losing herself again. And that changed everything. Her courage wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply a steady breath, a grounded presence, a quiet promise she made to herself. I will not abandon me again. And that promise became her anchor as she stepped forward into whatever came next. In the end, Ava didn't walk away with a dramatic victory or a neatly tied resolution. Life rarely offers such simplicity. What she walked away with was something far more meaningful. Understanding. Understanding that boundaries are not weapons. They are declarations of worth. Understanding that choosing yourself is not selfishness. It is self-respect. And understanding that love is not proven through how much pain you can endure, but through how safely you can exist within it. She learned that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about refusing to keep breaking quietly for the comfort of others. The world around her might still debate whether she was right or wrong. But Ava finally stopped living for the courtroom of public opinion. For the first time in a very long time, she trusted her own heart more than anyone else's expectations. She realized something profound. Life is not meant to be lived constantly, apologizing for existing. Somewhere along the years, she had been conditioned to believe that goodness meant self-erasure, that devotion meant exhaustion, that love meant silence. But life had taught her differently now. Goodness can still be gentle while honoring limits. Devotion can still be loyal without destroying self-care. Love can still be deep while respecting boundaries. Ava didn't stop loving the people in her life. She stopped loving them at the expense of herself. And that distinction changed everything. It allowed her to breathe again. It allowed her to feel worthy. It allowed her to reclaim a sense of identity she had quietly lost. And with that identity came dignity, not the loud kind the world demands applause for, but the quiet kind that simply allows a person to stand tall in their truth. Of course, the journey didn't end here. It never does. Healing isn't a final destination. It's an ongoing relationship with yourself. There would still be hard days. There would still be misunderstandings. There would still be moments where her heart would ache for how things once were. But now, she was walking forward with awareness instead of fear. She understood that relationships built on dependency may fall, but relationships capable of growth will eventually adjust. She understood that those who truly love you will learn to meet you differently, respectfully, fully. And she understood that even if some people never understood her choice, it didn't invalidate the necessity of it. Because your life cannot be lived through someone else's comfort. Your peace is not a luxury. It is a right. So what is the life lesson? It's this. Being kind does not mean abandoning yourself. Being loving does not mean becoming invisible. And being strong does not mean enduring endlessly. Sometimes the bravest, most loving thing you can do, for yourself and others, is to finally say, I matter too. Ava's story reminds us that setting boundaries does not destroy real love. It reveals it, strengthens it, and purifies it. And perhaps the most powerful truth of all is this: when you stop betraying yourself to be loved, you finally discover love that doesn't require betrayal. In the quiet that followed her choice, Ava didn't just reclaim her home. She reclaimed her life. And that is a lesson worth remembering.